Okay, I think we can get rolling here. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Jim Jensen with Fiducient Advisors, and welcome to our web chat here today, DOL Cybersecurity Guidance for ERISA Plans. And if this is not where you're supposed to be, feel free to drop off, but you're going to miss out on 45 minutes of some of the best information you're ever going to get in your life. So with that as a warning, why don't we get rolling here? One quick housekeeping item from a tech issue perspective. If you've been joining us a number of times, you know we've done a lot of these WebExes, and sometimes when we drop down the presentation to bring up the view of the panelists, the chat box disappears. So to avoid that, we're actually going to just keep the presentation up here today. You'll see us as we're speaking. And speaking of the chat box, that's how we're going to get questions from you. And so please, we'd love for have this to be interactive with questions from the audience. So please use the chat function. One of my roles here today in keeping this on track is to monitor that chat function and present those questions to our panelists. So please do that. We'd love that. In terms of the panelists, you see our faces here on the screen and then to the right as well. But I'm Jim Jensen. I am a partner and senior consultant with Fiducient Advisors. I am also a member of the firm's Defined Contribution Business Council. And we are tasked with creating content that our clients would find of value as fiduciaries, as well as committee members. And so I'm honored to be part of that. And one of the items of that is this presentation here today. Joining me is Patrick Chase. He is our Executive Director of Enterprise Applications. Many of you know Fiducient is a joint venture with NFP, and we use the resources of a large company like NFP to keep our cybersecurity and technology issues top of line. And so Patrick's going to be speaking here today with regards to what Fiducient's doing in terms of cybersecurity protocols. Maybe just one little sidetrack here. You also know that DeMeo Schneider and Fiduciary Investment Advisors became Fiducient about a year and a half ago. And back to the old DeMeo Schneider days, I was actually deemed the cybersecurity leader of the Chicago office. And if you're laughing right now, my colleagues laughed when they got that news. And so again, one of the silver linings of us merging to become this leading consulting firm is the fact that now you have Patrick allowing us to sleep better at night, knowing that I'm not in charge of cybersecurity issues any longer. Mike Hines is with us. Mike is a partner with Skadden Arps. Mike regularly litigates putative class action and shareholder derivative proceedings brought under state and federal securities laws, including ERISA and Securities Exchange Act of 1934. So Mike's going to be providing the legal, the side of this guidance. And then Phil Bello, who is a principal with Clifton, Larson, and Allen, is going to bring kind of the practical audit side of things here. Phil serves as a lead project manager for SOC engagements, and with that, an in-depth understanding of SOC reporting requirements. His consulting work also includes information security reviews and risk assessments. So maybe before we walk through the agenda here, just really quick and then get rolling, many of you are aware of Fiducient's work when it comes to cybersecurity already in place as part of our quarterly governance calendar review. For a number of years now, we've partnered with record keepers to give you insight in terms of what they're doing from a cybersecurity perspective. So general cybersecurity best practices are not new, but now we have, rightly so, some guidance with regards to what should and should not be done. Why is that? Well, increased threats. Listen, these numbers are big. And by the way, this came out with the DOL's announcement back in April that there are 106 million defined contribution participants. This data is as of 2018, so it's bigger than that now, and $9.3 trillion in assets. The markets these last 2 years, it's well above 10 trillion now. So there's real money, real threats here. The bad guys are chasing the money. And so that's why now we have this guidance to walk through here today. In terms of the agenda that you see in front of you, Mike's going to walk through those updates in terms of the guidance, implications for plan sponsors, also for participants. Mike's going to lead off the discussion on best practices for service providers, but that's really where Phil's going to jump in and talk again to the practicality and kind of the real world implications of those. And then we're going to wrap up with Patrick speaking to Fiducient Advisors protocols there. So maybe if we can move to the next slide here. And Mike, we're going to start with you here. So back in April, again, as I mentioned, the Department of Labor announced cybersecurity guidance with language that reveals sponsors and fiduciaries have a duty to mitigate cybersecurity risk. Maybe for fear of jumping into the punchline here, let's take a step back and tell us what's contained in the guidance package, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And hello to the audience and good afternoon, or at least good afternoon here on the East Coast. The guidance package, Jim, it's really presented in 3 separate documents, and it's directed at 3 separate constituencies. And the first one, is, as we have here on the slide, is a document that's addressed to plan fiduciaries and plan sponsors. And it's presented as a tips document, and it's called Tips for Hiring a Service Provider with Strong Cybersecurity Best Practices. There's a second document that's directed at participants and beneficiaries of plans, and that is presented also as a tip sheet, and it's called Online Security Tips. And we'll be talking about those in a little bit. And last, but certainly not least, there is a guidance document, the third, directed at record keepers and other service providers of plans. And that one is called Cybersecurity Program Best Practices, which I think Phil will be talking to us about in a little bit.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive into those in depth here, but maybe what prompted this release? Like, what's the bottom line here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's hard to say precisely, but obviously ERISA plans, especially retirement plans, can hold millions, if not billions of dollars of assets. And they make pretty attractive targets for people that want to do bad things. And although it's relatively recent focus of numerous government agencies, including, for example, the SEC, just back in June, I suspect most people are familiar with the SEC's request from what was likely hundreds of public companies regarding potential exposures to the 2020 SolarWinds cyber attack, which was very well publicized. But whatever the rationale was, Jim, the guidance is grounded on the premise that responsible plan fiduciaries and plan sponsors have a duty to take appropriate precautions to mitigate cybersecurity risk. And it's really the first time the DOL has spoken about it. And although that's the fundamental premise, you'll see later on that, or it's important to emphasize that the guidance also recognizes, in the form of the tip sheet that I talked about, that participants do have an important role to play in cybersecurity.
Great. Staying here on slide 6, and here's where we kind of get into the meat of our discussion here, if you will. What guidance does the DOL give to plan sponsors and plan fiduciaries?
Yeah, so the DOL does so, and like I said, a tips for hiring a service provider with strong cybersecurity best practices. And the document's really focused on the DOL's view, Jim, that ERISA requires plan sponsors and other plan fiduciaries to prudently select and monitor service providers with strong cybersecurity best practices. And so in that regard, this particular document includes due diligence. I broke it up this way in due diligence tips and contracting tips.
Okay, so then therefore, in terms of the due diligence guidance, let's start there.
Yeah, a good place to start, because the guidance suggests a significant due diligence obligations on plan sponsors. And one thing I think to consider as a plan sponsor or other plan fiduciary is including the DOL's due diligence tips or guidance in any RFP for a new service provider, right? So for example, a fiduciary might want to think about including a question in an RFP that asks about past security breaches and how the service provider responded to the breach. A fiduciary might also consider inquiring about whether the service provider has any insurance policies that might cover losses caused by cybersecurity or identity theft type of breaches. And then, and lastly, I would suggest that a plan sponsor at least consider evaluating existing service providers using this guidance to help mitigate cybersecurity breaches.
Absolutely. Great advice there. Now, what about the contracting guidance? How does a plan sponsor implement?
Yeah. Yeah, the guidance, it really suggests that plan sponsors, it uses the terms make sure that a contract, quote, requires ongoing compliance with cybersecurity and information security standards. And really the DOL specifically cautioned plan sponsors to look out for contractual provisions that attempt to limit the service provider's responsibility for IT or for IT security breaches. And last but not least, the guidance provides that sponsors should try to include terms that enhance cybersecurity protection, such as the 5 issued on this slide. So one example of that in this first bullet about information security reporting, that guidance suggests that the contract should require the record keeper or another service provider to annually obtain a third-party audit to determine compliance with information security policies and procedures. So that's relatively new, but a tip that the DOL would like to see.
Awesome, thanks. Why don't we go to the next slide, and this we shift gears a little bit to the participant functions and what guidance is provided to participants.
Yeah, one of the 3 documents is it is in the form of a tip sheet for participants, and it's called Online Security Tips. And it includes tips that you might expect to see in online security. Things, and we have them here, but things such as strong and unique passwords, implementing multi-factor authentication procedures, recognizing how to recognize possible phishing attacks, creating public Wi-Fi, things like that. Things that we and probably most of the people on this call are used to seeing, but that participants might not be used to seeing, or at least might not think about.
And it is interesting, right? I mean, we know all of these. We're in some regards beaten over the head over and over about these, and it's all rightly so. We've all probably had instances where either we were close or got hooked. That being said, is there any type of onus on the plan sponsor, do you think, for participants to know this? Is there going to be some education requirements as a part of this?
Well, that's a good question, and that remains to be seen. But one thing that I would advise, that we would advise, that plan sponsors and fiduciaries think about, is considering distributing the online security tips exactly as they are in the document, and maybe the document itself, to participants and beneficiaries, and keep a record of doing so. I think that could be important later on as the DOL or the courts try to work through these tips and this guidance to see how it's all going to play out.
Yeah, true. All right, let's move to the next slide number 8. And what guidance does the DOL give to plan service providers?
Yeah, and last but certainly not least, the guidance includes a document directed at record keepers and other service providers, and they call it, it's called Cybersecurity Program Best Practices. And it includes 12 points, and they're reflected on this slide. I think Phil will probably talk about some of these. But the interesting thing from my perspective, Jim, that this document in particular, and more so than the other 2, it reads, from my perspective, a bit more prescriptive. And although it's in the form of best practices, it really seems to be closer to minimum expectations of what the DL expects to see of a record keeper or another service provider in their cybersecurity programs.
And so maybe before we hand things off to Phil, what's the takeaway? From your perspective, from a legal perspective, if you will.
Yeah,
what's the main takeaway here?
Yeah, a few things, and it remains to be seen. But much like what the SEC is doing now and really has been doing, the guidance may foreshadow DOL enforcement initiatives, to the extent there is a security breach. And you could, and because this guidance is written in 3 separate documents directed at 3 separate constituencies, you could see it being used, well, first as a standard for determining whether a fiduciary acted in a prudent way, because it's very clear the DOL is focused on that. But it also could be used because it recognizes that participants have a role to play, you could see this guidance being used potentially as a way to allocate responsibility for a loss in the event of a cybersecurity breach. And for example, let's say a participant was subject to a phishing attack, and a thief or a thief got personal information from their participant. You can imagine defenses for a plan sponsor or a record keeper around that, and say and like, well, hey, wait a minute, the participant actually gave this information. So remains to be seen how it's going to be used by either the DOL or the courts, but you could see it as a way to allocate responsibility.
Very good. Thank you on that. And again, if folks have questions, please use the chat function and send those in. But maybe Phil, we'll bring you in here now, and sticking with this slide. So how does an organization practically implement a security review of record keepers and other service providers to ensure they're meeting, these 12 best practices?
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon, everybody. I think it's kind of interesting. So when you look at these 12 and the other guidance around hiring a service provider, two of the three documents that they put out are related to that third party. One is for the fiduciaries and plan sponsors, how to hire one, and then here are the requirements for the record keepers and third parties, these 12 bullets. I think if you're looking at how to hire one, you want to definitely also consider these 12 bullet points and using these as a checklist when you're going through that process to make sure that they're meeting all 12 of these. They're covered at a high level in that kind of how to hire document, but using this as part of your risk assessment process, I think would definitely be valuable. But when you think about kind of practically implementing a review and hiring and a risk assessment process, the tips that they provided are definitely helpful and a good starting point. The risk assessment process can be a lot more than that, because you'll have different vendors, different third-party service providers that all pose different risks to your organization. So developing your own risk framework that addresses your scope of third-party service providers and creates a process that's feasible to maintain and update, that you can review on an annual basis, I think is very important. And using almost a bucket approach. So you've got different third-party service providers that you would group into maybe a high risk, a medium risk, or low risk type buckets. You don't even need to use 3 buckets. You can use 2, you can use 5. It just depends on how much resources you have to put into developing that framework and maintaining that. And once you go through that initial process and defining those buckets, maybe they're high risk vendors, you want to go through and perform this assessment, look for these kind of 12 items, and do a reassessment on an annual basis. Your medium risks you want to do once every 2 years. Low risks you may not need to do at all because they don't have any of your data or don't really pose much risk to your organization. So I think that risk assessment process is really important to actually be able to manage this guidance and go through it. Once you have that defined as well, then kind of going back through and looking at contracts, because it's going to be difficult to take the guidance here and try and renegotiate a contract mid-term. So starting with new vendors, making sure you've got a sound process in place for what you would require. And then as contracts come up for renewal, or you've got maybe some opportunity to renegotiate, applying those at that point is definitely, I think, a good way to implement this and have it be something that's manageable.
That's awesome. Thanks. We actually did have a question coming in, and it fits here, I think. And I don't know if Phil or Mike can take this, but where can an individual find the DOL's guidance package?
Sure, I can take that. It's right on the DOL's website. They have a news release. They have a section called news releases. You can go there, and it was April 14th of 2021. There's a news release that has a link to each of the documents in the guidance package. And the other thing you could do, you could just type into Google guidance package, although I see now that
I just dropped in the link.
That's easier.
It should be helpful.
Thanks,
That's the main page that Mike was just talking about with the news release, and then has the three separate links that are bulleted out there to each of the three guidances.
That's multitasking from our auditor here. Thank you so much, Phil. Hey, along the lines and with your experience, from common audit findings, what of these best practices do most organizations fall short on?
I think one of the most common, actually, and maybe stems into the reason for the guidance being put out there, but number 6, the process of just managing those risky vendors, cloud or third-party service providers. When we're going through audits, that's a lot of times an area that every organization struggles with. The smaller organizations lack resources, expertise, and just the ability to implement a process around it. And so they can struggle from that standpoint. Larger organizations that maybe have a process in place, they have the challenge of the volumes. They have a lot more third-party service providers, more vendors to try and manage. And that volume can definitely become a challenge if you have 30 or 40 high-risk third-party service providers that you're trying to perform an assessment of and obtain all of the either SOC reports or security questionnaires that you require them to complete, reviewing their policies and going through that whole exercise. If you've got that kind of volume, it can be difficult to stay on top of. So we run into that quite a bit, which I think probably was part of the reason for this guidance being put out, just because even smaller organizations over the past 10 years are really increasing in that volume of third-party service providers that they're using, just with the kind of advances technology, ease of transferring information securely and efficiently. You can send large amounts of data very quickly now, as opposed to just years ago. So it probably stemmed from that a lot, but we do see that as kind of an area where organizations fall short. One of the other areas is number 9 talks about effective business resiliency program, and kind of groups a little bit with 12 response to security incidents, but not necessarily the response. The plan of the response is where a lot of organizations fall short. You don't think it's going to happen to you. You don't think you're going to have a ransomware attack or a phishing attack that allows a malicious attacker in to steal the data, but it does happen to everybody, and there's risks. Just by opening, going to Google, looking at the news or anything like that, every type of organization is at risk, no matter what type of data you have. So you got to think more along the lines of, when it happens to you, are you going to be ready for it? And so that is definitely an area where we find gaps and deficiencies in having that plan in place. A good place to start is just to make sure that everybody in the organization, from top down, knows who their first phone call is if they accidentally click on something or their screen turns black and they think that they have somebody who's taken over their computer, or a ransomware screen pops up. Everybody should know who that first call is. The end users could just be the security officer or an IT individual, but everybody should have that number kind of stored in their personal phones and given out to them, so the security officer can start enacting the plan. It's also important from that standpoint to make sure you've got good cybersecurity insurance, and you're working with your insurance provider to know what organizations they partner with. So just like car insurance, they may have mechanics that they partner with, and you can only go to those mechanics for the service on your car if you've got an accident or some issue. Cyber insurance providers have organizations that you can proactively reach out to, get on maybe a retainer basis to have them on call. Will respond within 12 hours, 24 hours to come out, help you assess the situation and provide some forensic analysis. So if there is a breach, you know exactly who was breached, how many people, how much data was involved, and that will help down the road as well if there's any litigation associated with the breach. So those two are definitely areas where we see deficiencies.
And that's great. You mentioned their cybersecurity measures, and there's a question that just came in. Is it good for the plan sponsor to have some cybersecurity insurance relationship or record keeper, or both? And maybe that's to both you, Phil, and Mike, to provide perspective on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think any organization that is managing any type of data or financial information should reach out to their insurance provider and inquire about cybersecurity insurance. They'll walk you through the process to scope it and underwrite it and determine your risk profile and where your responsibilities are for the data that you have. But yeah, every organization should at least be looking into it. Mike, I don't know if you've got something to add there as well.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that, Phil. I'm thinking of it in a 401k type plan. The record keeper likely has the information that's going to be subject to attack. And so certainly the record keeper should look into that. But if the plan sponsor is concerned about that, I think they should talk to an insurance provider around those regards. So nothing to add other than I agree with you, Phil.
And I think there was a last part of the question, is it worth it? So cyber insurance is, it's something that has been developing over like the last 10 years. 10 years ago, it wasn't really too popular, and the underwriting was very different depending on where you went for it. It's gotten a lot more mature now, and I think as insurance companies are paying out claims associated with cyber insurance, they've developed a pretty good product that does make it worth it. It just depends on the level of coverage that you'd like to get. We don't sell insurance or anything like that, but as part of audits, it's always a good thing to check for. So I talk about it with my clients quite a bit. But yeah, I think definitely worth it, especially just because of the ability that they have to partner with those incident response type organizations that will really help you if something does happen. Even if it's not a major incident, they'll be able to kind of bring you back online and get you up and running as quickly as possible while still helping you manage the risk associated with it.
Yeah, awesome. And I would add that the guidance does mention insurance a couple of times, and so I do think it's important for a plan sponsor to look into it, either their record keeper or themselves or both, and document doing so.
And Phil, back to the slide here. Are these ranked in order of importance, or is there, if I'm a plan sponsor and I want to start implementing, or what's most important? Where do I start?
Yeah, so I think so these best practices, the guidance gears them towards the record keepers, service providers, but they're great for anybody to kind of look through and do an initial assessment of for their own organizations. I think personally, one area, even before you look at these, that it might be missing is it doesn't really talk much about inventorying your data and information and systems. So before you can even know what your risk is or implement a cybersecurity program, knowing what type of data you have, where that data is, what systems you have, where the lines and boundaries of those systems are, would be a great place to start. And then if you also really are struggling to start, number 3 talks about having a reliable annual third-party audit. I would say just disregard the term audit and think of it more as a consultative type of approach. Partner with an organization that knows security controls, best practices, the frameworks, and can really help you implement something that's practical for your budget and the resources that you have to maintain it.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything, maybe last parting words, Phil, before we shift gears over to Fiducient here?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of reiterate again, the risk here seems to be with 2 out of the 3 guidance pieces being geared towards knowing where your data goes when it goes to third parties and managing that risk. It's not, using a third party doesn't mean that you transfer the risk to them. It still is your risk, and you need to have some process for managing it. So just keep that in mind. It's you can't just think it's out of your company's IT. So keeping it out of mind.
Great, thank you. And again, if there are any questions on the audit side, please keep them coming through the chat. And then now I'm going to introduce Patrick here. And in terms of our clients wondering, how did this guidance impact Fiducient? And Patrick, what are you doing with your team and to make sure we're, as an organization, on the up and up from this guidance perspective? So Patrick?
Hi, Jim. Thanks. I didn't realize I had such big shoes to fill, that Jim was the previous cybersecurity. I'm happy that I have the assistance of, I think Jim mentioned, NFP via our joint venture. I'll mention a couple of things that we have in place that provide some incredible strength to our cybersecurity protocols. And the good news for Fiducient too is that these guidelines are really nothing new. Fiducient, along with all other investment advisors, has been under the watchful eye of the SEC forever. The paragraph on this slide is from the 2019 SEC Examiner's Priorities Report. You can see almost all of those best practices items that Phil just went through are in this list. Having cybersecurity practices in place, doing risk assessments, vendor management, training, incident response, all on this list. So Fiducient has been held to this standard forever, and these guidelines are right in our wheelhouse. So I'm going to cover a couple of the specific practices that were mentioned previously on the next slide, just to get into a little bit of detail. So it all starts with the plan, in my opinion, or as the guidance phrases it, the program. So again, via our joint venture with NFP, we have an incredibly strong cybersecurity program, and it starts with a SOC 2 certification. I'm sure at least some of you have heard about SOC 2. I know Phil's heard about it quite a bit. And so what does it mean to be SOC 2 certified? Well, in order to receive that certification, a company must have its security program and processes confirmed by an independent auditor. So they're certifying that the cybersecurity program meets or exceeds the best practices in 5 trust service principles, as they're phrased: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So by leveraging NFP, our joint venture, in the SOC 2 certification, we start from a very strong cybersecurity program. One of the topics pointed out previously was vendor management, and I definitely agree with Phil that it is difficult to have the time and resources in place to do appropriate vendor management. So we've put together a security compliance team, put that in place. They're tasked with reviewing new vendors and re-reviewing vendors annually. And we require that all major vendors, especially those that have any sensitive information, provide us with their SOC 2 certification doing the due diligence process. So we're ensuring that we apply appropriate resources to this critical piece of the guidelines along with, around vendor management. So the last item I wanted to cover was business continuity and incident response. And it's a critical part of any plan, like was mentioned earlier, preparing for when things don't go as planned, because they will, right? So we put into place a team and systems that help us handle any events or incidents that occur. We've got a team, the CERT, the Coordinated Incident Response Team. They're responsible for managing this. We also have systems in place that are constantly scanning the environment at Fiducient Advisors, the technology environment. And it works really from the ground up, where if a user, let's say, clicks on a link in an email that they shouldn't click, and it pops, hopefully our local control will prevent that page from popping up, but that's going to log an event. The system will log that. It'll get queued up for a technician on the CERT to review. There's a hierarchy in place with our process. There's 4 levels of this hierarchy. That's a pretty simple and low level event, but anything that gets escalated higher up may eventually get to the CTO, for review and response. So we have systems and a team in place to deal with any events or incidents that are occurring in the network. And one other point that I want to mention around incident response is, it was mentioned, the SolarWinds incident was mentioned. So global incidents like that, what we've learned is that when those events occur and there's a lot of activity, a lot of folks trying to get somebody to help them respond to that incident, some firms had to wait days to get the attention of a responder. So we've hired an incident response firm on retainer. We have a 2-hour service level agreement with that incident response firm. So if a large event does occur, we were not impacted by the SolarWinds one, but if a large event does occur and we need an incident response firm, we've got a firm on standby to help us with an appropriate response to the incident. So hopefully I've given you a sense of how these guidelines can be managed in practice and what we're doing at Fiducient to cover some of these main points that were brought up. Again, the good news for us is this is nothing new. We've been focusing on cybersecurity forever, but we do think that these are a good thing for plan sponsors and plan participants to keep in mind when thinking about their service providers.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And we did have a question come in here, and Phil, maybe this is perfect for you. Someone asked, where can they find a company that can audit a service provider's cybersecurity protocols? Does your firm do that? Are there specialties for that we can assist with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's just kind of on this slide as well. The SOC 2 is designed to be kind of that audit, that certification. So when you think about like a record keeper that has many customers that they're managing data for, similar to how you get, an annual financial audit performed, that you have a document then where you can share it with maybe some lenders or investors who are thinking about investing in the company. The security audit can be kind of used in a similar manner. So those record keepers may undergo a SOC 2, just like Fiducient has here. The idea then is that they have one independent report that was audited to provide that certification that they can share then with their customers, and that helps to reduce some of the resource requirements needed for managing, because every one of their customers is trying to make sure they're doing their due diligence, following these checklists and ensuring that their record keeper has security practices in place. So instead of responding to hundreds of security questionnaires, they can have this one report that they hand out. And different industries have different kind of standards when it comes to that. SOC 2 is designed to cover multiple industries and be industry kind of agnostic there. It does cover those 5 trust service principles that Patrick was talking about. So it has a pretty wide scope of what's included in it as well. But yeah, CLA definitely provides the SOC 2 certification. There's others out there because there isn't one standard like a financial audit per se that covers security for every industry and every size organization around the country. So there's different ones like an ISO certification or a high trust certification, or NIST has a framework that you could have an audit against as well. So there's a lot of them out there. But yeah, we definitely help with that as well as other security companies that are out there.
And so is it a fair assumption then that your quality record keepers have a SOC 2 that can be shared with their clients upon request if necessary? Is that a fair statement?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would say any quality record keeper or any third party that you're working with when it comes to plan administrators, trust organizations, record keepers, things like that would have a SOC 2. If they're going to be storing or processing any type of data for you, they likely would have a SOC 2, especially if they're of quality standard, like you're saying, Jim.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do perform SOC 2 audits for a number of those companies, so that's kind of where I'm getting my information from on that one.
All right, thank you. Again, we really appreciate the chat questions. I'll give a minute to see if any more come in here before wrapping up, but really want to thank you for listening to us here today. Maybe just one item before wrapping up and thanking my panelist here. Fiducient will be partnering with record keepers in the month of October for group sessions in terms of how the record keepers are following the guidance. And so we're going to be hosting these where plan sponsors who work with a specific record keeper can all get together in one group session, such as similar to this, and have the record keepers present what they're doing along those lines. So keep an eye out for those invitations. Again, those will be in October. Our new plan sponsor article, which is going to be distributed literally within days, if not a week here. Our title article is on the cybersecurity guidance. So you're going to have hard copy in terms of what we've talked about here today. And again, this has been recorded. If you want to share this with your friends and family, you'll be getting that email likely tomorrow, if not later today. That does it for us. I want to thank Mike, Phil, Patrick for helping us out with this great session. And as always, if you have any questions as a follow-up, didn't have time to do a chat here, Follow up with your consultant at Fiducient Advisors, and thanks for joining us here today. Bye-bye. Have a great afternoon.